So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and this is the virtual reading group. Thrilled to be with you today to discuss Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. We are in chapter 3 of the book, which is called An Expert on the Jewish Question. In many ways, this is the core chapter of the book. Now that's going to sound strange to some of you, and I get it. And there's obviously a lot more to come, and it's not to say that this is the be all and end all, and I certainly wouldn't say stop reading the book here. But if you remember what I said in the first session, that she never mentions the banality of evil until the final line of the book, where she says that this whole lesson of the trial has been a course in the word and thought defying banality of evil. Well, what does it mean, the word and thought defying banality of evil? And it really gets expressed most clearly in the epilogue, right, which came after. But it's this chapter, An Expert on the Jewish Question, where Arendt really begins to explore and plumb the depths of what she means by the banality of evil without ever mentioning it, right? You're never going to see her mention the term. But we'll get there, and it's largely in the second part of this chapter. So the chapter can actually be thought of on three parts, maybe. The first part is sort of a short history of Eichmann's work, his career as a bureaucrat in the Reichssicherheitsamt Bureau 4B, in which he becomes an expert on the Jewish question, and her looking at how that happens and the history of it. The second part is her discussion of Eichmann's early career in that, and what he accomplished, but also his first vice, which she calls boasting. But then comes, beginning on page 47 to 48, the core of the chapter, and as I said, really, in many ways, one of the core sections of the whole book, from 47 until the end of this chapter, where she talks about the more and the most decisive flaw in Eichmann's character, which is, as she writes, is the almost total inability ever to look at anything from the other fellow's point of view. This inability to look at anything from the other fellow's point of view, as some of you who've read some Hannah Arendt know, is one of the key ways she defines thoughtlessness. Thinking for her is to look at things, to think in an enlarged way of thinking, in an erweiterte Denkungsart, to cite Kant, an enlarged way of thinking, and to think perspectively from different perspectives. And so it's in this chapter where she really begins to develop this idea that the core character flaw in Eichmann was his inability to think, which is what she's going to end up calling or saying was the factual basis for her claim, the banality of evil. Okay, having said that, let's try and read through the chapter. She starts with the fact that in 1934, Eichmann was bored, and as bored, he joined the security service of the SS, or the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst. The Sicherheitsdienst, or the SD, was a new apparatus in 1934, and it was designed largely to spy on party members, and thus to give the SS, the Sicherheitsstaffel, ascendancy over the regular party apparatus. It was a It was a spy organization within the party. Um, it was led by Reinhard Heydrich, and he is, Arendt says, the real engineer of the final solution. But it became, over time, the core of the secret police, or the Gestapo. Um, of course, that merger between the SD and the SS and the police only happens in 1939, but Arendt is convinced that's what's really going on here. The SD, which Eichmann joined, was concerned with studying the enemies of the Reich. And as such, there were many enemies of the Reich, and Eichmann's first job was to study and research Freemasons. You may remember that he almost joined the Freemasons back in the early 30s when he was still in Austria, but he switched at the last minute and joined the Nazi Party instead of the Freemasons. Obviously, a helpful choice in his own career, but now he becomes someone assigned by the Nazis to study one of their enemies, the Freemasons. That lasts only 4 months. He was bored with that, and then he is transferred to a new bureau, which was to study the Jews in 1935. 1935, Arendt tells us, is the year where Hitler is giving speeches about peace and how he is going to maintain peace in Europe. It's the year where he says he's not going to ever take over Austria, and he's going to respect the borders of Poland. It's a year in which the main Nazi enemies are still considered socialists, intellectuals, anti-fascists, and the Nazis are not yet focused exclusively on Jews. They're still trying to consolidate their power. In 1933, Jews had been excluded from the civil service of Germany, but they still were largely able to contribute in society. They had private businesses were left intact, and those were left intact until 1938. It was the same year as the Nuremberg laws, which deprived Jews of political rights, but not civil rights. And it's an important distinction. Jews were no longer Reichsbürger. They were no longer citizens of the Reich, but they were still Staatsangehörige. They were still had recognition in the state as an official minority with certain rights. There were also things that they couldn't do. They couldn't have sex with non-Jews. They couldn't marry non-Jews. No woman under 45, no German woman under 45 could work in a Jewish house. But in some ways, Arendt, and this is Arendt at, again, somewhat of her provocative nature, says on page 39, actually quotes some members of the Jewish organization in Berlin. She says that Jews now felt that they had received laws of their own and they would no longer be outlawed. The Nuremberg laws, she says, established a level on which a bearable relationship between the Germans and the Jewish people became possible. Now, this is, of course, a strange way of putting it about laws that made the Jews second-class citizens and took away many of their rights. But her point is that, Jews had always been discriminated against in Germany, and certainly since the Nazis came to power. And she says what this did is actually took away some rights, but actually gave them other rights, in the sense that it said what they could do and what they couldn't do. And that now Jews at least felt, some of them, she thought, that they now had, they now knew how they could live in Germany, and thus that there were rules, and they could at least depend on those rules. It gave a kind of stability to this. And this was something that she says the Jews accepted and some Jews embraced. I mean, I'm sure they didn't like the Nuremberg rules, but they thought it was better than nothing. And when Eichmann was asked by one of the judges how he reconciled his claim that he was not an anti-Semite with the anti-Semitism in the party, he answered with a German proverb, which I find difficult fully to understand. I've looked it up. It's not entirely clear to me how to interpret it. But in translation, and of course, translating proverbs is almost impossible. It says, nothing's as hot when you eat it as when it's being cooked. And Arendt says many of the Jews said the same. They all lived, she says, in a fool's paradise. What I take it to mean is that, in the pot, the Nuremberg laws, the anti-Semitism of the time looked pretty bad. But when you take out a piece of meat and you live on your own and you eat it, you think, oh, I can live with this. I can make do. And there's an amazing ability that humans have of making do. And I take it to be that's what both Eichmann and many Jewish Germans thought at the time. Arendt calls it a fool's paradise, but she certainly understands it. All of this lasted up until about 1938, which was the year of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And she says that's the time when the Jews woke up and realized that things were really bad. Now, of course, you have to remember, Arendt herself was arrested and left Germany in 1933. So, we have to take somewhat with a grain of salt what she's saying. She certainly knew things were bad in 33. But I think what she realizes is that many German Jews were able to continually say, it's not so bad. We can make do. We can live with these laws, etc. But in 1938, during Kristallnacht, 7,500 Jewish shops were vandalized and their storefront windows were broken. Almost all the synagogues were burned. 20,000 Jewish men, were taken to concentration camps. And this is when Eichmann's job really gets going. When he entered his new job, responsible for the Jewish people under the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the first thing he did is he read Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, which is the sort of founding book of modern Zionism. Arendt says it was the first serious book he ever read, and in a line that is, of course, ironic and yet has been quoted out of context to mean she took it seriously, she writes, "It converted Eichmann promptly and forever to Zionism." Now, this is, she certainly didn't believe Eichmann was a Zionist, but this is what, this is the problem, is that she wrote the book, as she said, in a deeply ironic tone because she found it the only way she could deal with it, and people didn't understand her irony. He came to believe, he said, as he repeated over and over again, that the only solution to the Jewish problem was a political solution, not a physical solution, by which he meant expulsion and Zionist emigration rather than murder or genocide. He began to write pamphlets arguing for Zionism, in the sense of arguing for expelling the Jews and giving them a homeland. He read Adolf Böhm's book, History of Zionism, which is a big book and not one easy to read. And she says that this was his schooling in Jewish affairs, and it was all in Zionism. So while she was ironic, and I think it's clearly ironic, she does think that Eichmann came to see himself as someone who made common cause with the Zionists. She says on page 41, and I think this is a very important part of the text, she says that he came to see that the Zionists were idealists like him. And by idealist, she means men who lived for an idea. Men who would put an idea above their own well-being or above individual well-being. So Zionists would say, I'm willing to die for the Jewish idea of a Jewish state. And Eichmann would say, I'm willing to sacrifice my own morals or ethics for a Nazi Reich. But he thought there was a common cause, because the Nazis wanted Germany to be free of Jews, Judenrein, and the Jews wanted to get out of Germany, and the Zionists at least wanted to get out of Germany and be in their own state. And he said, they have common interests. And so he began to work towards this common interest. As a side note, she says that the greatest idealist of all amongst the Jews was Dr. Rudolf Kastner. Costner will come back a number of times in this book. He's an important figure. Um, he was the Hungarian Jew who Eichmann negotiated with in the 1940s, I think 1944. And Costner uh, organized an enormous amount of money that he raised from Hungarian Jews to create what was called the Costner train, a train of Jews that was sent to Switzerland and saved 1,600 Jews from Hungary. The problem was that in the negotiations to save these 1,600 Jews, many of whom were Costner's friends and family, but also people he thought were important, um, uh, he didn't tell the other Jews in Hungary what was going on with the concentration camps, which had now become extermination camps. And he held that information secret from them. Uh, and worked to save some Jews in order to help get them out so they could help establish a Zionist state in Israel. He was then accused of this in Israel in the 1950s, and a trial was held in Israel where he charged his accusers with defamation, and he lost the trial. And in fact, the judge at his trial was one of the judges at the Eichmann trial, and the judge at Costner's trial, when he found that Costner had in fact made this bargain with the Nazis, said that he had sold his soul to the devil. He was then assassinated in 1957 by Israelis for what he had done. In any case, Costner became one of Eichmann's collaborators. And Arendt is making a case here that Costner and Eichmann, obviously very different, obviously under enormously different situations, and she's not blaming Costner in any way for being like Eichmann, right? But what she's saying is Eichmann saw Costner as a fellow idealist, someone who was willing to sacrifice others, many others, in order to bring forward his idea of Zionism. And she says that's how Eichmann saw Kastner, but it's also how Eichmann saw himself. The second part of the chapter is now when Eichmann emerges in Vienna in 1938. He's transferred to Vienna, and this is the first time that Eichmann is given real responsibility in the war. Before this, he's largely been doing research and helping some German Jews emigrate, but hadn't really been given a whole lot of responsibility. But in 1938, in Vienna, he's in charge of the forced expulsion / emigration of the Viennese Jewish population. He calls this the happiest year of his life. He found success in Vienna, she says. In 8 months, he was able to expel / help to emigrate 45,000 Jews. How did he do it? He extracted money from the rich Jews in order to help them emigrate and also pay for the emigration of the poor Jews. The problem with emigration was that if you had to go get one paper allowing you to sell your property, another paper allow you to get a visa, a passport, another paper to get a visa. And often these papers had expiration dates that cost a lot of money. And by the time you got one, you had to wait for another. And by the time you got the other, the first one had expired and no one could leave. And so he set up this factory where in one building, Jews could go, and get each of these papers stamped at once. And, as they came in with a lot of money and no papers, and they left with no money and their papers. And Eichmann saw this, and the Nazis saw this as a great success. And he would boast about it. He boasted about how he helped, do this. He boasted how he helped the Jews do what they wanted, which was to leave Germany and Austria. And he boasted about inventing Theresienstadt and the ghetto system, although, of course, he didn't do it. He boasted about coming up with a plan for Palestine or Israel. Of course, he didn't do that either. Um, he became very, at this time, he lived the big life. He was actually, this is when Eichmann became known to Jews and to Nazis as someone who could get things done. The Jews thought he could get things done by getting them papers to get out. Um, and the Nazis thought he could get things done by getting the Jews out. And this was, as she said, in his mind, the happiest time of his life. This is where on page 47 to 48, she says, all right, all of this, is bad, boasting, bragging, whatever. But if you really want to understand the core character flaw, the decisive flaw in Eichmann's character, she says it's the almost total inability ever to look at anything from the other fellow's point of view. She then repeats on page 49 that it's an inability to think, namely to think from the standpoint of somebody else. Her point here is that in Vienna, Eichmann would say things like, me and my men were pulling together to help the Jews, right? And the Jewish functionaries would come running to me to help them, saying, we need to get out of Austria, help us. And I would help them. And they would unburden their hearts to me, and they would tell me their grief, and I would listen, and I would help them get out of Austria. And Eichmann thinks I'm working with the Jews to push forward my ideal of a Jewish-free Germany and their ideal of Zionism. And she says, this unbelievable inability to understand the perspective of the Jews, this inability to look at things from their point of view, this is what she means by superficiality. This is what she means by banality. She says that in his police examination in Israel, she says it contains a gold mine for psychologists on 48, because he would use these words and not understand the complete idiocy the way he was using them. He was talking in one thing and saying another. The judges, she says, called it empty talk and thought it was feigned, thought maybe he was lying. But Arendt says, no, this is actually essential to his character, to who he is. And this is a question that will come up over and again. And when we read Bettina Stangneth's book, Eichmann Before Jerusalem, at the end of this group, you'll see that she says, look, Arendt was fooled by Eichmann. He was lying and she didn't know it. She considered that quite closely, and she doesn't think he is lying. She's like, look, we can't know whether he's lying in every case, but she thinks this is his basic character. And we'll have to make our decisions as we go along about who is right on that. But she says on page 49, the longer one listened to him, the more obvious it became that his inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think, namely to think from the standpoint of somebody else. She says no communication was possible with him, not because he lied, but because he was surrounded by the most reliable of all safeguards against the words and the presence of others, and against reality as such. What is this safeguard? What safeguards him from reality? What allows him to live in this sort of unbelievable fiction that he's helping the Jews and that they want his help? I think there's an amazing story about this on page 51. She's saying on page 50 that he complained to his Jewish interrogator in Israel, the captain who was interrogating him, Avner Less, who's an extraordinary figure in his own right. And there's some interesting stuff written about Avner Less as well. But Avner Less is charged with interrogating Eichmann. And Eichmann says to him things like, I had such a hard life. I couldn't get promoted. I wanted to get promoted and they would never promote me. And you can imagine this German Jewish, captain sitting there listening to Eichmann complaining about how hard his life was. And she's like, Eichmann just has no idea how his words sound. And she says that within this, there's the story he tells of a Jewish leader in Hungary named Stauffer. And This is a fascinating story. For those of you who've seen the movie Zone of Interest, which is an excellent movie, and I've written a fair bit about recently, um, it concerns Rudolf Hess, who was the commandant of Auschwitz. And the story goes like this: Stauffer was a Hungarian Jew, and because he was cooperating with Eichmann, he was protected. He didn't have to worry about being deported. But he got worried one day, and he went into hiding. And because he went and got into hiding, he was captured and he was sent to Auschwitz. So Eichmann goes to one of the leading German figures in the occupation of Hungary and says, "Can we get my friend Stauffer?" Calls him my friend, right? Because he thinks of him as his friend, which is of course idiot, but that's fine. Can we get my friend Stauffer out of Auschwitz? And the Nazi official says, no, there's a rule. Once you're in Auschwitz, you can't leave. And you can imagine why that rule exists. They don't want people to know about it. And so Eichmann actually travels to Auschwitz the first time he goes there and goes to Rudolf Höss and says to him, is there any way to get my friend Stauffer out? And Höss says no. And he says, all right, can we at least make his life easier? He's an old man and he's helped us a lot. And so he gets him reassigned from hard labor to simply sweeping a path with a broom where he's allowed to sit down on a bench. And Eichmann says to Stauffer, I'm sorry I couldn't help you, old friend. I'm doing my best, but at least you have an easier job. And is that okay? I hope it's okay. And, how are you? Will that be all right? And Stauffer says, whatever. I mean, what is Stauffer going to say? And Eichmann leaves thinking he's done a good deed, not knowing that 6 weeks later, after this, as Arendt says, this normal human encounter, Stauffer was dead, not gassed, but apparently shot. And she asks herself, and she asks us, how can someone like Eichmann say these things? How can he believe this? Is it bad faith? Is it lying, like Bettina Stengneth argues? Is it self-deception? Is it simply outrageous stupidity? Is he just doing what every criminal does? She quotes Dostoevsky, who says, when he got to Siberia, every criminal said, "I'm not guilty. I'm innocent." Is it just like normal criminal, insistence that what we do is not so bad? And she says, no, it's not that. She says, Eichmann isn't a normal criminal. He's not an ordinary criminal. And he's not just lying. She says that he and most of German society were fully shielded from reality. The whole society agreed with them. They didn't meet people who disagreed with them. Even the Jews they talked to said, please, Mr. Eichmann, you're my friend, help me get out. He thought he somehow came to convince himself that he was, this idealist. And she says that his astounding willingness, even in Argentina, during the interviews with Wilhelm Sassen, right, which are going to become very important when we read Bettina Stengneth's work, even during these interviews in Argentina, as well as in Jerusalem, his unwillingness to admit his crimes, his willingness to admit his crimes was due less to his criminal capacity for self-deception than to the aura of systemic mendacity that had constituted the general atmosphere of the Third Reich. He admitted his crimes. He said, look, I played a role in the Holocaust. I killed lots of Jews, or I didn't kill them. I helped kill them. And he says he wants to find peace with his former enemies, as if that's something that they would want to do. She says these were outrageous cliches, stock phrases, but they gave Eichmann an enormous sense of elation. She says that these phrases that he kept repeating to himself, he has senses that he holds on to, that, I killed all these people. I did it. I'm not going to run away from it. I was wrong. I will now hang myself in a public square as a warning to anti-Semites, he says. She says that these kind of things, he says, they give him a sense of meaning, but he has no idea what he's talking about. She says in his mind, he could say these two things and see no contradiction between them. One, he says, I will jump into my grave laughing at the fact that I helped, bring about the murder of 5 million enemies of the Reich, or Jewish people, depending on who you believe, what he said. And at the same time, he says, I will gladly hang myself in public as a warning example for all anti-Semites on this earth. And depending on when he says it, he believes them both. And he doesn't hide the fact that he says them both. He goes on and on at the trial about how he will never swear an oath. He says, I swore an oath once to the Nazis and it was a mistake, and I'll never do it again. And I'll never swear an oath. And no matter what you do, no matter how much you tell me, I will never swear an oath. And then they say to him, all right, you can testify here, and you can either testify on oath or without an oath. And he says, no, I'll swear an oath. And she's like, how can somebody say these things? It's only because he doesn't speak what he means. He speaks empty phrases. He speaks cliches. And this is the banality that she finds in Eichmann. So we're not yet at the banality of evil, but we're at banality. That he just doesn't think. He can't think he can't know what he's thinking. He doesn't mean what he says. And he says, and this is where she says on page 54 that he was not a monster, but a clown. Okay. This is, like I said, I mean, in many ways, it's not the only court chapter, but it begins to explore this thoughtlessness, this banality, this superficiality, this inability to speak what one means or to mean what one says, this living in a cliche world that protects you from reality. And so this is such an important chapter as a result in Arendt's understanding of who Eichmann is, which she had started in the last chapter on the accused, but is continued here. All right. I'll stop there. We have time for a good discussion. Please remember you can participate in two ways. One is in the chat. Please be respectful of others. You can certainly disagree, but don't yell at each other for who you are. And secondly, you can raise your hand and participate in the discussion. And I look forward to that discussion. I encourage. I just came from a talk by one of my heroes, Carol Gilligan, author of In a Different Voice, which was a book in college that made a huge impact on me. Her new book, Is It a Human Voice? Just noting that the first 5 people with their hands up are men. That's great, but I encourage people of different gender identifications to join us as well. And I will try and make sure we give as many people a voice in our discussion as we can. James, you're up first.
Roger, how is this different from what's going on today?
James, yeah. How
It's
is it different from what's going on today? Well,
if once you get into the repetition, on and on and on and on, and you start buying into it, the woman who is running the Republican Party now, Lara, is that her name?
Laura Trump.
Lara Trump? No, we're past that. We're past that. How is it different? How is this different from what we're experiencing today? Or is that what I should take for this and beware?
So, I think there's different aspects to that. One is obviously there's a difference, right? We're not expelling Jews or anyone yet from the country, at least citizens. We are.
We're getting to it with that 25, the 25 program.
Well, so as I said yet.
Oh, yeah, okay.
There's not yet a system of forced expulsion. There's not yet a system of denaturalization for racial groups, not that I know of. I'm happy to have someone, not happy, I'd be, if someone wants to tell me specifically of, I mean, there is rhetoric, and I think it's rhetoric that has to be taken seriously coming out of former President Trump, now Republican nominee, almost Trump, that dehumanizes immigrants. And yet, again, those are not citizens. And I think it is a big difference. So I think there are differences that we should at least acknowledge. We don't yet have a Sicherheitsdienst that is spying on people, as far as I know. Maybe we do. Uh, but let me say on the other side, the 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 general um uh thoughtlessness of people, of bureaucrats, of people in control, uh the ability of people to not think from the perspective of other people, uh to uh to sort of um uh, go along with their jobs and seek to advance their careers and know that they're doing things wrong. I mean, let's leave Lara Trump out because I don't know, but Ronna McDaniel, I think, is a fascinating case, right? Ronna McDaniel was um I don't know what the exact title is, but the chairperson of the Republican Party for a number of years. Um, she clearly knew that January 6th was a criminal behavior, and she knew that Trump helped support it, and she said so in private, and yet in public, she towed the party line and said things like, "Oh, it was just a protest; it wasn't violent," um, and she said it wasn't so bad, and etc. Now that she's been replaced by Trump's daughter-in-law, uh, she sort of starting to say, "Oh, well, I actually knew it was bad, and it was bad, but I couldn't say it." Well, you know, people are upset at her for that. And she got hired and then fired from NBC. Now, on the one hand, you know, there are plenty of people on the left who have done similar things. I mean, again, I don't want to. It's not the exact same thing, right? But one of the heroes of the left is Stacey Abrams, who has continued to resist the fact that she lost an election in Georgia a number of years ago. And people don't call her an election denier and things like that. And I'm not saying I don't think what she did is nearly as bad as what Trump did at all. But you get people. There is a kind of way in which people are able to um, uh, uh, justify what they're doing as part of their job and deal with it, even though they know that there's something wrong with it. I think what Ronna Daniels did is much worse. And we have to at least address that issue. So yes, I think that what Arendt is talking about, this inability to think from the perspective of other people, this ability to um, hide from reality in cliches and to simply think, "Oh, I'm just doing my job." It's not that, again, Arendt's argument is not that he was a bureaucrat and bureaucrats are ruining the world, although she doesn't like bureaucracy. It's that he was a bureaucrat who couldn't think out of his bureaucratic language, and he used his bureaucratic language to prevent himself from confronting the moral tragedies that he was participating in. Um, he used the bureaucratic language to become superficial. And absolutely, that's happening all around us. It happens around us all the time. Um, the difference is, how bad is the um, moral tragedy that we are hiding from ourselves. Um, and I think we are getting to the point where, I hope not, but there may be really serious moral tragedies that come down the pike. And what you are seeing right now in the especially in the Republican Party in this country is an incredible um, uh, ability slash willingness of Republican Party leaders um, to convince themselves that every step along the way uh, towards um, abandoning certain basic norms of legality and and liberality is and abandoning those norms is okay in the name of, well, the other side's doing some of it too, and therefore it's not so bad, and therefore we can keep doing it. And um that is happening today, and one can't shouldn't look away from it, and it is incredibly dangerous.
You can't get a job with the RNC unless you commit.
Yeah, well, the RNC, look, the Republican Party, I mean, this is again part of the problem. The Republican Party has become the party of Donald Trump, hook, line, and sinker, loyalty oath, and all. And there are still enough Republicans who don't want to admit that, and they become, if you go back to the origins of totalitarianism, they become the front organizations. They become the outer side of the onion of the party that makes the party look somewhat respectable. Like Nikki Haley. Again, Nikki Haley took Trump on at the very end of her campaign, but she still hasn't said that she won't endorse him or won't vote for him. The idea that somehow she still wants a career in the Republican Party. And because she wants a career in the Republican Party, she's not willing to cut her bridges to it. And that's I think there's an enormous amount of self-deception going on there. You just saw the senator from Alaska,
Murkowski.
Murkowski, who said that she's not going to vote for Trump and she's not sure she's going to stay in the Republican Party. It's taken her 7 years, but finally, uh, and I at least respect that move. But we'll see.
How do
But again,
we, how do
but
we,
she's someone who didn't win the Republican nomination the last time she ran and ran as an independent.
how do we interact with these people on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, look,
I'm sorry, I couldn't, that's
no,
a,
it's all right. It's a good question. How do you break through this? And you can't just yell at them.
no.
You can't just, to some degree, it's the question of the moment. How do you, you're not talking about 10 people. You're talking about, uh, 30 to 40% of the country has come under the spell of this, and then another 10%, 10 to 15%, is willing to vote for them for cynical or other reasons. Um, how do you address that? Just like she says, Eichmann never encountered people who disagreed with the policies he was meant to enforce. And even the Jews had to come to him and say, "Oh, I understand you have a hard job, Mr. Eichmann. Let me help. Help me help." You know, how do you break through that false reality that you've created? It's very hard, and it's because not only is that what people are told, but they have a deep self-interest in believing it. Um, and so it's very hard to break through that. You have to um uh you have to talk to them. It's going to take you have to talk to them in a personal way. You have to tell them, show them the other stories. It is possible. I mean, like, what's interesting is that on the one hand, a number of the January 6th defendants who've been convicted, are still Trumpians, and they've been singing this national anthem that Trump now plays at the beginning of his rallies, where he talks about them as hostages and political prisoners. But there are a number of them who have said, I realized that what I did was wrong and that I was misinformed. Um, you know, how do you get through to those? How do you get through? What happened to get through those people and not the other people? I'm not sure I can tell you any one answer. You just have to keep trying. You have to talk to them. You have to get them to go step by step through their process with you. But some of them it will never work for. And then it gets depressing. You think, oh, we can't do it. Just forget about it. But I think you have to do the work.
It's
Go
like
ahead.
Obama said the other night, you just have to listen.
You have to listen. You have to talk. And you can't get discouraged that most of them will not listen to you. But you have to hope that you peel enough off that, you begin to pierce the veil.
Thank you, Roger.
Yep. Stephen.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for your exegesis. I think it's really articulate. I can see, the dilemma for the reader, and I also understand Aaron's position even more so than I did before you spoke. But I'd like to draw attention to Aaron's sense of humor. So on page 50, she writes, the comedy breaks into the horror itself and results in stories whose macabre humor easily surpasses that of any surrealist invention, but macabre humor. So the Stouffer episode struck me as an example of blaming the victim. So Eichmann blamed Stouffer for hiding and not showing up for deportation. On page 51, he writes, I hear you made a mistake. You went into hiding or wanted to bolt, which, after all, you did not need to do. Now, does anyone believe in their heart that had Stauffer appeared as ordered as he would have been allowed to escape deportation? Stauffer knew what would happen, as did Eichmann. This is not a point of thinking, as Arendt says Eichmann was incapable of putting oneself in another's shoes, but having knowledge of what would inevitably happen. Orders had been given and there was no escape. Now, if this episode really happened, it shows Eichmann to be a monster. He does not visit Stauffer to comfort him, but to mock him sadistically, to blame him for his fate. The machine-like hideous language of officialdom that Eichmann uses in telling this story to the court is monstrous. And I believe this is damning to Arendt's thesis that Eichmann was a banal clown, as she writes, quote, it was difficult indeed not to suspect that he was a clown, unquote. So I guess the question, Roger, is what in this episode is humorous, funny, as she has it elsewhere?
Well, so okay. First of all, the idea that Eichmann first goes to what's his name?
Yes.
Ebner. He goes to Ebner and asks if we can get Stauffer out. And Ebner says, no, he was clumsy. He went into hiding. We can't do anything for him. There's a rule against it. And then Eichmann travels all the way to Auschwitz simply to plead with Huss to get Stauffer out and have this conversation with Stauffer. You want to say that this is all done simply to mock Stauffer and that this is an act of monstrosity. Again, all I can say is that strikes me as almost impossible to believe. There's no evidence in Eichmann's character or in this that's what's going on. Why would he travel in the midst of the war, in the midst of this, simply to go and mock this guy that he thinks of as a friend? Now, again, I think he's deluded, but I don't think it's a kind of monstrous desire to just turn the screws into Stauffer.
Can I respond to the comment that this is the middle of 1944? This is the largest deportation of European Jews to concentration camps. I assume Eichmann is busy at this time, that he would travel solely to Auschwitz to meet with a Jew who wants to get out of his predicament. Now, I thought about that. I thought, okay, maybe he's there on official business. Maybe he's going to see how operations are going, and he decides to meet with Stauffer. But again, I come back to this quote. He's blaming Stauffer for his own predicament.
Well,
we really believe
Stephen, first of all, the context of this is the same time he's in negotiation with Rudolf Kastner to sell the freedom of 16,000 Jewish leaders. he needs the Jewish leaders like Stauffer and like Kostner on his side. That's the way he works. So, first of all, there is a reason that he's trying to help Stauffer. He's actually depends upon, I mean, this is the strategy he used. He depends upon the cooperation of Jewish leaders to get his job done. And Stauffer was one of them. And so he needs to be seen as, if you want to look at it completely cynically, he needs to be seen as supporting them. I take it to be more than that. I mean, I know I'm not going to convince you, but that's okay. We can disagree. Again, it strikes me as he has deluded himself.
Okay.
I don't see any other meaningful explanation for this.
But
As for the macabre comedy of it, yeah, I think I think it's horrific and hysterical.
how do you see it as this? Where's the funny part? What am I missing? Please help me understand.
The funny part is that this
Come on.
guy, Eichmann, actually believes that he's friends with Mr. Stauffer. That's the funny part. And if you can't see that as funny, and you can't see that as macabre humor, then you're not going to understand Arendt's book, and you're not going to understand what I'm saying. And I understand that, right? I mean, some people just can't see it, or won't see it, or they disagree, and that's a legitimate disagreement. But the idea that someone like Eichmann would actually think my friend Stauffer, and that we had this human encounter. I mean, again, one option is to say he's lying. Arendt didn't think he was lying. I don't think he's lying. I think he's completely delusional. And,
Okay.
Again, I mean, I don't know how you can, there's no way to fundamentally answer this question, right? I mean, if you say to me, I think he's lying, and I think this is all, a monstrous attempt to turn the screws into Stauffer and to make him even more miserable than he was by blaming the victim, I can say I disagree with you, but I can't prove you're wrong and you can't prove I'm wrong, and vice versa. At some point, you just have to look at the situation and think, what do you believe?
Well, that quote stands out as pretty strong. When he says, "You need not have done what you did, Stauffer," and I don't, Eichmann not knowing what would happen to Stauffer, and Stauffer not knowing what would happen to him if he showed up for deportation. It's just too hard to believe. It stretches the bounds of credulity to
Well, just
believe.
think of it this way, Stephen. You're about to send a train out of Hungary with 1,600 of the saved Jews. The Kostner train is about to leave. So, I think Eichmann's thinking, yeah, you were about to be saved. You didn't have to do this.
You know what? The research that would be needed to find out what the criteria is for those who would, I mean, Stauffer, if he was an idiot, wouldn't have bought into that he would be one of the few that would have joined that 1,600. And that was a relatively small number when we're talking about the number of Hungarians who were deported to Auschwitz during that time.
Okay.
So yes, I think we put our finger on this judgment of Arendt in some ways.
Yeah.
And you're right. It can go either way, but I don't think we should just move on from it. I don't think, as she anticipates the criticism against her, that people will think that Eichmann is a malicious liar, but she anticipates it and she tries to shut down this dialogue on that. Just like, well, okay, let's just leave it at it's your opinion versus mine. I don't think we can, because I think it's at the heart of this definition of what is, look, if we have a human that's monstrous, what does that human look like? Does it look like Eichmann or not? And I think we have to take this very seriously, but thank you for your comments.
Thank you. I'm just going to break up a little bit. I'm going to get everyone in, I promise, but I'm going to break up the order just to bring in some gender differences here. So Vigdis, I'll have you next.
Okay, thanks. Um, I have a couple of questions. I think they go together, and it's the first I was thinking of this his laughing at the grave, thinking of what he had done, and also hang himself regarding this anti-Semitism. And it, to me, it looks like when Arendt describes him as an idealist, a man who lived for his idea and who was prepared to sacrifice for his idea everything and especially everybody. And in a way, he kind of did that in his work. He did it as good as it was. He was an idealist in his own view, but he also see these he couldn't be an anti-Semite because he was, I mean, he was into this Zionism and called them, they had also this idea they lived for, so he couldn't go against them either. So in a way, if he could go from one to the other, because both of them was a kind of expression of ideas and someone who followed the ideas. And the other thing I had is from this to think, where she said he couldn't look at anything from the other fellow point of view. And also she says to think from the standpoint of somebody else. And I wonder, I think of this in a way like it is to think of things from different perspectives. And maybe not especially from one special person's perspective, because you think in, you see that, okay, this happens, but it can be viewed from different perspectives, and the ability to think of it from different perspective. And that's, to me, it's important when she is very much into, it's a way of thinking in another person's perspective, not feel them, not empathy. So that makes the difference. And I think all of this goes together with a kind of the ability to pay attention to facts and to keep your common sense intact, and not instead of following ideas and following the logic of ideas. Because I know she also mentioned somewhere that these people could change from one ideology to the other, because they kind of are into this kind of logical thinking and not paying attention to facts and using their ability to think and their enlarged mentality. I know this was maybe a bit much I thought on the ways, and I wish I could say this in Norwegian, but I can't, so
I know. I'm sorry. I'm not sure there was a question, but I mean, I think you're absolutely right about, the last part. She's not talking about trying to feel from the perspective of others. She's trying to think from the perspective of others. And what she thinks is that to think from the perspective of others means to really take seriously that you're talking to a guy, Captain Abner Liss, who was in a concentration camp and a DP camp and then comes to Israel, and you're saying, oh, my life was hard. I was a Nazi Gestapo agent and I couldn't get promoted. And she's like, are you serious? I mean, how can you ask for sympathy from this guy? And it's just a complete inability to think from the perspective of others. And she's like, and again, go back to Stephen, that's funny. I mean, it's sad, it's disgusting, but it's funny. And how can we not think it's funny? That's what she's saying. And some people can't. I mean, and I don't blame them, right? You can't, some people just can't laugh at it, right? There's this debate about whether we should be able to laugh at the Holocaust, right? I mean, it's Roberto Bernini, right? It was one of the first people to write these funny movies about the Holocaust. And he got criticized for it. But there's something just so macabre and absurd about it that she can't but laugh. I mean, she says to Mary McCarthy, over and over, I just kept laughing when I was there. And I kept laughing while I was reading the transcripts. And one group of people might say you're heartless. Another group might say you're being taken in. And another might say, there's something deeply funny about this tragedy. And that's the hard part.
Maybe it's a kind of way to survive utter stupidity in her eyes.
Yeah, I think
Because
so.
it seems so stupid that you just have to laugh. A
Yeah.
kind of way to survive the whole thing.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. John Holt.
Hi, Roger. I want to focus on the phrase systemic mendacity. When we were talking earlier about the connection between what was going on in Germany in the 30s and what's going on now, this idea of starting with the birther lie, Trump's birther lie against Obama, and then systemically and constantly thereafter. Washington Post chronicles over 30,000 lies. It's constant. So a lie does not correspond to reality. It does not correspond to what we understand or grasp as facts, perceptual facts. And if you do it constantly, systemically, it disrupts reality. People constantly have to adjust. You know, the crack about it's always better to tell the truth because it's easier to remember. When you tell a lie, what zone am I in? And I think of a couple of things. One, a literary reference, Gulliver's Travels, the Houyhnhnms or the Houyhnhnms, and they don't lie because how can you say the thing that is not? It's profoundly confusing. The other thing that I think of is Steve Bannon when his advice to flood the zone with shit. Flood the zone with shit. That is lies, inventions, and so on, so that reality is completely gone. And the only reality that continues to exist is not external, it is all internal based on one's feelings. And the feelings that are addressed, say, in the birther lie are racist feelings. And that is sustained as a foundation of a new truth. Okay, so that's the way I'm trying to understand this notion of systemic mendacity. And then finally, she writes on page 52, it is sometimes difficult not to believe that mendacity has become an integral part of the German national character. And I realized that she wrote this a little while ago, and that since she's written it, Germany has undergone a severe introspection of what had happened. Nonetheless, it was part of the national character in the 30s. And it's becoming, unfortunately, a character of at least 30% or more of the American Republic right now. Anyway, that's my observation.
Thank you. Thanks, John. I think so, what she's thinking about on 52, which you pointed us to, is the practice of self-deception had become so common, even in the 1940s and 50s after the war, that people in Germany would say things like, we didn't know, what was going on. And she just doesn't believe that, right? She's like, it's hard to, and they would say things like, this was the battle for the destiny of the German people, as if, which made self-deception easier on 3 counts. It suggested first that the war was no war, right? It was a battle. Secondly, that it was started by destiny and not by Germany. And third, that it was a matter of life and death for the Germans. All of these were untrue. There are always going to be cliches and propaganda out there, right? There's propaganda on the left, there's propaganda on the right. The difference, the danger is when the propaganda becomes total and totalizing. And that's the danger of totalitarianism. I think that's an important distinction. Eichmann himself, what she's saying is he lived in a world in which he just never confronted people um, who really offered any pushback to his ideas. And that's why, as I think it was James earlier who said, or someone said, you have to keep talking, you have to keep listening, and you have to keep talking and pushing back. Um, you know, it's much harder to keep a totalizing lie, what you called systemic mendacity, in place when people keep resisting. And it's when people shut up or comply, or as Václav Havel once said, when you put the sign up in your grocery store saying, the party is great or whatever, simply because you don't want trouble, that's when systemic mendacity becomes fully totalizing and systemic. Um, and so that's why it's so important to keep talking. So thanks. I'm just gonna shuttle along here, but Monica Byrne, you're up next.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to reflect back on when James started and asked by saying, how is this different than now? And I tend to be wary of hyperbolic comparisons to the Holocaust. I think sometimes a failure of imagination, we just keep going back to tragedies that we can recognize. But at the same time, I find myself right now continually reminded of the interwar years in Europe, this period of middle and upper middle class success, particularly for Jewish families, feeling that they had assimilated to a certain part, that they were living in many parts of Western Europe successfully and felt like we're good. I'm a German first and then a Jew. I'm Austrian first and then a Jew. And seeing the rights peeled away little by little, chip, 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 and looking at how we are experiencing things like that. We are not the Jewish community is certainly experiencing episodes of anti-Semitism, but in the United States and around the world, we're seeing democratic backsliding, illiberalism. We are seeing the rights of women, reproductive rights moving to the point where it's not just you can't get an abortion, but women's movements are being tracked across state lines to make sure that they're not doing particular things. We're seeing certain curriculums being banned, books being banned. And in the framework of contemporary capitalism, we are also all really busy just surviving, living our lives, getting through. So we say, this is really horrible. And then we continue doing our daily life because we need to do that. And I think that that is how these things happen. That is how these authoritarian things, these totalitarian things happen, step by step by step. And I remember watching, in 2020, The Handmaid's Tale set in contemporary times and seeing how these like little changes happened over a period of a few years. And suddenly there was this radical circumstance. And so while I don't want to say, oh, this is just like then, I also want to say we need to pay attention and be aware of what warning signs and be aware every single time we watch something chipped away and eroding that we are going somewhere. And unless we intervene in that, we cannot be surprised when we end up somewhere scary. We've seen this play out over and over again. So that's less of a question and more of a statement.
No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, all I would say is, and this is an Arendtian response as well, history is not fate, right? You're absolutely right. We are at a moment of incredible precariousness. But that doesn't mean things are going to get as awful as they got then. And even if they get awful, it's going to be in a different way. And we have to be aware of the differences as well as the similarities. I mean, I can tell you a story in which what we're seeing is the great rebirth of American democracy, right? And I've told this story in public, right? Which is that, in the post-World War II era, America became increasingly led by technocrats and bureaucrats and civil service agencies, and people were happy and well-fed and rich, and stopped engaging in politics and stopped engaging in the public world. And over time, after the 1960s, you had the liberals got involved and they changed the world. And they changed the world. They changed what the country looked like. And then after 20 or 30 years, a bunch of, you know, conservatives said, we don't like this world. And they got involved and they have taken over town halls and local governments. And they changed the world through the Tea Party movement and now the MAGA movement. And maybe now you'll see the left actually get off their, get out of their cafes and their computers and go out and act and become activists again. And if you look at it that way, you're seeing a return of politics in a way that I think Arendt would be incredibly happy about.
I
But
appreciate that.
there's a chance that, of course, it doesn't go that way, and that you see the Justice Department dissolved and courts dissolved and things going south in a very fast way. I don't think that's going to happen, but some people do, but I think it's not going to happen because I think there's enough people now who are aware of the dangers and will fight against it, and that's what needs to happen.
I have to say your framing of it like that made me feel a glimmer of hope that I have not felt in quite some time. And I really appreciate that. And I'm grateful for that. And it encourages me to continue working on our work on deliberative democracy.
Well, as you know, that's the work I
Thank
feel
you,
very
Dad.
strongly
So
about, and that's why I
I'm,
think, and that's
I'm
part
with
of
you.
the reason. That's part of the reason I feel strongly about it is I think that we are at a point where there's now opportunities to bring people back into politics. Okay, let me move on, but that was great. Thank you. George.
Okay, well, I'm going to go back to my point of view as to an author who happens to be a very astute and a Polish Holocaust survivor who also commented on the Eichmann situation by writing a story about a bunch of robots who were very efficiently killing people and led by a bunch of even more efficient robots. And finally, one of these more efficient robots was finally caught, and they started taking it apart to find out what's making it what it is. And lo and behold, it was a human being masking as a robot. And this really reminded him of the Eichmann situation that, and what he said, only humans are monstrous enough of all creatures to do these cruel things to other humans. And what, again, this was sort of also in another place, he sort of commented on Arendt's view of the situation and said, well, she's the funny one because she's sort of using a retrospectoscope to say that she knows better of how things should be done. And whereas all these people who actually went through these things are much more pessimistic about the situation. So I just wanted to bring, I think this was mentioned before, that as far as this author was concerned, that Eichmann was a monster, only a monster masquerading as a robot.
I assume you're talking about Stanislav Lem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I think Stanislav Lem's a great writer. I certainly read all of his novels when I was in grad school and enjoyed them and profited from them. Um, you know, uh, it's a great story. But that doesn't, I think you still have to look at each individual. Whether you like it or not, Arendt's approach in this book is to try and understand Eichmann. And she understands it by reading what he says, listening to what he says, and trying to make sense of him as a person. And you know, you can disagree with her, but simply saying, well, humans are monsters or humans can't do this doesn't help me. You got to actually look at the facts. And Arendt sat there at the trial and then pored over the transcripts and read everything Eichmann wrote, listened to him, and she made her determination based on her reading of the facts. A lot of people agree with her. Some people disagree with her. There's no answer, right? There's no answer. Eichmann was a monster or Eichmann was not a monster. There's no one answer. And anyone who thinks that there's a true answer, in that kind of objective sense, I think is deluding themselves. Arendt thought, look, this was the facts. I looked at them. I saw the facts. I made a factual judgment. That's how she understood what she did.
No, I realize that, but Lem, I think, was a fatalist in the sense that he was thinking that, we tend to be like Nero and play the fiddle while Rome's burning. And this is, I think, what is happening now. So in that sense, he was a fatalist.
Well, I hope we don't play the fiddle. Burn your fiddles, take to the streets, or go into a citizen assembly, or however you want to do it. But I think the lesson is if you keep your head down and hope it's going to get better, it's not. And I think that's certainly Arendt's lesson. So I hope we heed it. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Ken.
Thanks, Roger. I think it's great we read Totalitarianism before this book, because I think, it places this book in a way that we can't see Eichmann as a monster. I mean, I think we would all like to. I think that's the tendency, and the difficulty of this book is that she doesn't let us do that. She sees him as one of 80 million people in this country of Germany that turned to Nazism. And, if we take him out of that context, he's a monster. But he was in this context in a way that she doesn't distance herself from him. And what I'm really thinking about in this chapter, and what I think is most striking about this chapter, is humor in it. And what she calls him a clown, she talks about comedy. And there's a feeling of relief when she's writing this chapter that I don't see much in any of her other writing. That's really curious to me and interesting. And I think it's where there's this, she doesn't do what Amos Elan does in the introduction, where he says, it wasn't just demonic monsters who committed evil, it was also morons and imbeciles. She would include intellectuals. And she's not distancing herself from Eichmann, at least I think until this chapter. I think the difference between humor, when I'm reading this book, I'm going between, I have found it very hard to laugh at, I'd like to, but I think there's a relief in humor that a lot of the book I'm cringing when I'm getting so close to him and understanding him. But there's a relief in this chapter where I think it goes over the edge of cringing, and that's where it becomes humor. That's where the comedy is, in that relief. And I'm really curious about that. I mean, humor is really powerful for her. And I think that relief for her is when it's just so dumb, when he's ignoring so many facts, that she finally says, I couldn't do that. I couldn't be there. And there's a relief, a personal relief there that I feel as well, like it's gone over that edge, and that's where it becomes comic. And I think that's really important. I'm also paying attention to comedy because elsewhere she says humor is really powerful, right? She says dictators fear ridicule more than facts, more than logic, more than arguments. And there's something about bringing the comic or seeing the comic. I see it also, when we're talking about Trump today. I think when he decided to run for president was when Obama was ridiculing him at that press conference. And there's something about ridicule that he can't stand. Facts he can tolerate, arguments he can tolerate, but humor and ridicule are really potent forces. And sometimes I think that our comedians are more effective in fighting the Trump movement than anyone else.
I think that's an important point about about ridicule. But there's different ways comedians can ridicule. They can just make fun, but normalize, but they can also ridicule and shame. There's a way in which light comedy normalizes, in the sense that you make fun of everyone. But but you're right. I think there's very few things Trump finds more upsetting than ridicule. And um, so I think that's an important tool today. Part of the problem is we've really consigned comedy to the margins of our society, because at least on college campuses, you're not allowed to have comedy because it's considered to be offensive. And so, look at the Oscars. You can't make any kind of really biting jokes or anything because you don't want to offend the viewers. Or even late night comedy, it's very tame. And so if you're going to do that, you take out that ridicule. You take out one of the real protections of society against someone like Trump. But overall, I agree with you. I mean, I've read this book probably 10, 15 times. For the first, I had to come up to, I had to drive today to get here this morning, and I didn't have time to reread the chapter, so I listened to it. I don't know how many of you ever listened to books, but I was listening to it in the car on the way up here, and I kept laughing out loud. I mean, I couldn't stop myself. And I know Stephen will be like, "Oh my God, how could you?" Right? I get it. I understand it, but I just thought it was hysterical. I mean, there were times in it I just thought, "Oh my God." And I think that's, and people criticized Arendt for it. Gershom Scholem criticizes Arendt for it, one of her closest friends. And what she says is, "Look, I plead guilty. It's who I am. I thought it was funny. I can't change who I am. I really did think it was funny. And I think he's a clown." So there's not much else she could do. It's who she is. It's deep in her. And so that's how she reads the book. And it's one of the reasons I think so many people have found the book so problematic, is that they find that aspect of her reading of it problematic. Dina.
I'm wondering if there's something about her notion of unthinkingness in Eichmann that is so overwhelming that we'd rather have him be this monster. What about Arendt's notion of Eichmann's unthinkingness is so radical that it almost, so that some of us prefer, or many of us prefer, that Eichmann be a monster? Why is the unthinkingness even more revolting in a sense than his monstrosity?
Well, I think, I mean, I think this is where Stephen's point is taken well, and I think even Ken was just saying something along this line as well. We all have a kind of unthinkingness in us, right? No one thinks all the time. It's just not possible. And there's a way in which we all, if I'm a liberal, I'm going to give Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton a pass when they say things like Trump didn't really win the election in 2016. But I'm not going to give Ronna McDaniel a pass when she says, "Oh, it was just a protest." Right? We all have our prejudices and our biases and the way in which we don't think from the other people's point of view. And so to say that Eichmann, was unthinking, there's a way in which for some people it brings him too close. Now, Arendt is not saying that means it's not his fault, right? She thinks he needs to be hung. And she's not saying he's just like all the rest of us. But so many people interpret her that way. They interpret her to be saying, "Oh, she's saying he's just like the rest of us, unthinking." That's not her point at all. And as we get into the book, you'll start to see that she's actually not making that argument. But it's an argument that a lot of people think she makes. And it needs to be addressed. But people want, they want to believe that someone like who could do what Eichmann did was not anything like us, was completely different from us, was a monster. It's much more comforting to think that this could only happen with monsters and not with people who are so normal that they're scary, as one of the psychiatrists who examined him put it. And I think we all get that. I mean, it would be much more comforting if that were the case. Is that, I think did I understand your question?
Thank you.
What?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Gilda,
Thank you, Roger. Hi, from Washington State. Hi.
hi.
So a couple questions real quickly. First of all, in our chat, we were talking about World War I demoralization as causing the Nazis to rise, and we weren't sure among us if that was actually true. And then the second part of the question has to do with the film you mentioned, The Zone of Interest. I found it a wonderful film as well, as horrifying as it was. And that showed more what I guess we could call a monster mentality than Eichmann to me. So I will stop there and let you respond. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Gilda. So I mean, I haven't read the chat, and I apologize. So I haven't followed what's going on. I can't do both at once. But did World War I contribute to World War II, or the post World War I depression? I mean, I don't think you can completely separate it. I mean, there were obviously the economic suffering, the punishment, the humiliation on Germany, all of these things mattered. And so I wouldn't ignore that. On the zone of interest, I think you're whether Rudolf Huss was a monster. I mean, I think it's a fascinating question. And was his wife a monster? I think the premise of the movie is Arendtian, in the sense of looking at someone like Rudolf Huss and showing and his wife, how they just become able to flexibly open themselves or become to accept this world as a normal world. You never see anyone get killed in the movie. You never see anyone shot. You hear a shot, but you never see one. And it's that kind of incredible ability of humans to normalize the monstrous, which I think the movie's about. Whether that makes him a monster or not, I don't know. I don't know enough about Huss, but I think in the movie the attempt is to show him not as a monster, but as a family man and a normal
I
man.
know.
But I could
No,
be.
I agree with you. It's true. I think for those of us in the audience watching this, periodically we'll see the smoke rising, and that's
Yeah.
how you're reminded of where they are physically living and living what appears to be such a normalized life.
Yeah.
Just
I
remarkable.
agree.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Listen, we're at time, and I apologize. I have a couple more questions I'm not going to be able to get to today, but we'll continue on. We have a lot more to talk about in this book. And so Martin and Talita, I'll hopefully, if you guys have other questions, I'll bring you to the front of the line. We're not meeting next week. Next week is the Hannah Arendt Circle in New York, and I have to give a presentation at this time next week on anti-Semitism and Hannah Arendt. So I will be doing that. On Hannah Arendt's understanding of anti-Semitism, not anti-Semitism in Hannah Arendt. Just to be clear. So we will not meet next week, but after next week, we'll move back towards our hopefully more regular meetings. I apologize, it's been so sporadic just because I've been traveling a lot and busy. But take a week off, and we read for 2 weeks from today the first solution, Expulsion. And so just to give you, a sense, we're now getting into, some more, historical aspects. They're still fascinating. Are we reading? I think we may be reading that and the second solution, concentration, both of them for next week. But enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
It's great to see you.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.